For our next topic, we're going to review and go into a little bit more depth with the inflammatory response or inflammation. This is a critical, along with phagocytosis, this is a very critical process of your second line of defense. All right, so you talk about inflammation in your anatomy and physiology classes as well as this class. So this is a very complex response, but it's also a rapid response to injury or infection. So you don't have to have infectious microorganisms involved to have inflammation, which you know that if you've ever, rolled your ankle and you've had your ankle start to swell. You don't have to have a break in the skin. You don't have to have any invading microorganisms for inflammation to occur. Any type of damage to tissues will trigger inflammation as well. Because the purpose of inflammation is to fight off infection, fight off these foreign invaders, and repair injured, damaged tissues. How does this rapid detection take place? Well, if you do have microorganisms involved, then you're going to have this PAMP, PRR. Those things attaching to each other is one of the things that triggers the release of all these chemicals that immediately and rapidly sets off inflammation taking place. Same thing with injured tissue. When you have injured cells, they give off chemicals that are detected by the mast cells in your tissues, and then those mast cells release a bunch of chemicals that trigger inflammation. I imagine many of us, if not all of us, have experienced this before. Here's an image of some inflammation due to bites from those evil fire ants that we have around here. So you've probably experienced that before. And that is illustrating for you the key signs and symptoms of inflammation. And they are, the Latin terms for those are rubor, calor, tumor, and dolor. And a rubor, like ruby, redness, on the surface of the skin, or if you were looking at a mucous membrane like in the back of the throat. Rubor is a key sign of infection. And what causes that redness? Hopefully you're thinking vasodilation, the dilation of blood vessels near the surface, the increased blood flow to that area. You're seeing the redness associated with the blood. And that's where the rubor or redness comes from. Anytime you see redness on the skin, you've got increased blood flow to that area. You've got vasodilation that's occurring in that area of the skin, allowing more blood to reach the surface. Calor refers to the heat. If you have an inflamed area and you touch it, it's going to feel warm because you've got more blood flow to that area, bringing that nice warm blood. Tumor refers to swelling or edema. Edema is another term for the swelling that takes place. And what's causing that? So you've got this vasodilation going on. So more plasma is going to leak out of the blood. It's going to move out of the blood and into the surrounding tissues. And that's what causes the swelling or the tumor that you see there, like you see over here with these fire ant bites. So you get those blisters. When you have a blister, you've got that fluid that's moved out of the blood vessels and into the surrounding tissue, and it actually pushes the epidermis upward. Your epidermis detaches from the underlying dermis, and you get a blister. And dolor is referring to pain. So damaged cells will release chemicals that are detected by sensory neurons, and these sensory neurons that are involved in pain sensation will transmit signals to your spinal cord. Spinal cord sends them up to the brain so that you detect the pain sensation associated with that. All right, did I skip a slide? My computer's being real slow. Yes, I did. I think I did. My computer is not cooperating with me this afternoon. All right, here we go. The key steps of inflammation. So take a look at this table in your textbook and be sure you read through this, because this is going to go a little bit more in depth for you on the key stages of inflammation. But as I just described, injury, presence of microorganisms that get into the tissue, like here where you've got a nail that's penetrating the skin and working its way down into the underlying connective tissues. When something like that happens, mast cells, remember those? We talked about how those develop in the bone marrow along with white blood cells. And these are always stationed in your tissues. And so they have receptors that detect the chemicals that are associated with injury or the presence of microorganisms. And when they do that, they release chemical mediators. So they've got those little granules in there, and they dump out all these chemicals. And that's what sets off the inflammation reaction. You're going to have the dilation of the blood vessels almost immediately, the fluid coming out of the blood and into the surrounding tissue, leading to the edema that takes place. And so those are going to be your vascular reactions. So you're going to, blood vessels dilate, all this nice stuff comes out of the blood like neutrophils and other types of white blood cells to help try to fight the infection. A term in your textbook, exudate, we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. That's another term for fluid that's coming out, and then you have these white blood cells that are present there. It makes up an inflammatory exudate. You'll have edema and pus formation. So we've already talked a little bit about pus before, but edema is the swelling that's occurring due to the release of all that fluid out of the bloodstream and into the surrounding tissues. Blood vessels that have been cut, you'll have clots that form to seal those off. Scabbing will occur, as the injured area begins to repair. And finally, you'll have resolution and scar formation. So you've got all these white blood cells that are going to come in and help you fight off infection. Macrophages are going to come in and gobble up all of your damaged cells and tissues. And so then you've got to have recreation of the injured tissue as best as you can. And now sometimes that doesn't always, the old tissue doesn't get recreated quite like the original, and in that case you may have scar tissue formation. All right, so what are all these chemicals we keep talking about that are triggering things like inflammation? So many of those fall into a category we call cytokines. And cytokines, that's a very broad term for various protein signals. Most of them are proteins that are used. They're kind of like the hormones of the immune system. They're communicating molecules. When they get released, there are responses that take place. So they get released by damaged cells, phagocytes, mast cells, basophils, and so forth and so on. And cytokines are very complex. There are many different types. Almost all of them have multiple responses that they trigger. And so you could take an entire class learning about nothing but cytokines. There are people who do immunology research and spend their entire careers maybe studying one or two of these cytokines and all of their complex processes that they trigger. So when you guys are checking in your textbook gives you a pretty thorough overview of various cytokines and mediators of inflammation, things that are helping you trigger inflammation. The ones I do want you to be familiar with, TNF, or tumor necrosis factor. That's released by macrophages, lymphocytes, and others. A lot of these are released by more than one cell type. Now the name, tumor necrosis factor, it's named for how it was originally discovered. It was noticed to play a role in when your immune system starts to attack a cancerous tumor. That's one of the things your immune system will do. It actually will, in some cases, help you fight off cancer. So this was a factor that was important for telling the immune system to swarm in and attack and try to kill tumor cells. But since then, we've learned that it has many other roles as well. And one of those is inducing fever, triggering a fever, increasing chemotaxis. So when your phagocytic cells are hit with tumor necrosis factor, when they receive tumor necrosis factor as a signal, they become better at chemotaxis. And it also increases phagocytosis. So your phagocytes can get better at performing the phagocytosis process when they receive a signal from tumor necrosis factor, or TNF. Interferons, there are multiple types of those. We'll talk more about those toward the end of this chapter. And some of those are involved in helping with antiviral responses, and some increase the functions of lymphocytes. Histamine, now that's one that you learn about in your A&P classes as well. That's a chemical that's not a protein. It's a chemical that's released by mast cells and basophils, and it triggers vasodilation, which leads to the inflammatory response. So that's why when you have an allergy, you're having inappropriate inflammation to something like pollen or something else you're allergic to. And so that's why you can take an antihistamine. An antihistamine medication blocks the action of histamine and helps to reduce inflammation. Then prostaglandins, that's a broad term. There's more than one type of prostaglandin, but those are local cell signaling molecules that have many different functions in different parts of the body. So they're involved in pain stimulation, fever stimulation, and also constriction or dilation of blood vessels, interestingly enough. So when you take something like Tylenol or ibuprofen, that's a medication that reduces prostaglandin synthesis. So look at all these things prostaglandins can do in different parts of the body. That's why you can take a medication like that and it will reduce pain if you have a headache. It'll help break a fever if you have a fever. It can help reduce inflammation in some part of the body because those medications are acting on these prostaglandins that have many different roles. They're used for different purposes in different areas of the body. All right, so that diapedesis and chemotaxis, so we've already talked about those in earlier video clips. But when inflammation is occurring in a tissue, we talked about this a couple of clips ago when we were looking at neutrophils. Here you've got a blood vessel that's located inside a tissue, and let's say you've got an injury or an infection going on over here. These chemotactic factors are going to be molecules that will attract, kind of like a trail of chemical breadcrumbs, tell these white blood cells migrate over here, keep moving, because you've got some damaged tissues or microorganisms over here to come do phagocytosis on. But the process of diapedesis is where neutrophils or other white blood cells will squeeze through the walls of a blood vessel and enter a tissue. If you guys remember from that little video we took a look at, when you have an injury or infection going on over here, these cells that make up the wall of the blood vessel will send up little spike molecules that attract neutrophils and other white blood cells. It's basically like a signal, hey, you need to slow down, and this is where you got to exit. Go into the tissue over here and help clean up this damage and fight an infection. There's a link to a video here that you might want to take a look at where you can see some more examples of diapedesis and chemotaxis going on. Edema and pus, I think we've already talked about this quite a bit. Edema, that's the swelling in a tissue that occurs due to inflammation, and again, it's because of your blood plasma. Your blood vessels dilate, they become leaky, that lets the liquid portion of the blood come out. And that's actually a good thing, because if there are any toxic substances in that injured or infected tissue, it's going to help dilute them out so they're not concentrated quite a bit. Also lets clotting factors. You've got clotting factors in the blood, but they need to come out to help generate a clot to seal off breaks in blood vessels. And again, also, this is allowing white blood cells to undergo diapedesis and come into the tissues and out of the blood vessels. We've also talked about pus. All this extra fluid, plus damaged tissues, microorganisms, white blood cells, and especially the neutrophils. That's what makes up pus. And pus is almost always a sign of a bacterial infection. So here you're looking at the pharynx of someone who still has their tonsils, their pharyngeal tonsils. They're extremely swollen and they're covered in pus. Wouldn't you like to have that in the back of your throat? So if you saw that, that is a big time sign of a bacterial infection, because neutrophils make up a big component of pus. And remember, we said neutrophils are especially attracted to bacteria, and they don't live long. So they'll come in here and gobble up some bacteria, and they die, and they just kind of remain there and become part of the pus that's accumulating there. All right, so that was kind of a quick overview. Do read in your textbook more of the details about inflammation. The last process that we're going to talk about with regard to your innate immune system, second line of defense, is fever. Now, we talked a little bit about fever in Chapter 11, and we'll just cover a little bit more detail here in Chapter 12 and discuss more of the benefits of fever and why maybe we shouldn't be popping a Tylenol or ibuprofen or aspirin or whatever the minute we develop a 99.5 fever. Fever, actually, a lower grade fever anyway, actually has some benefits in helping us fight off infection. So we'll discuss that in the 7th video lecture for Chapter 12.